Hello there, Mandy here. Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart is not just a podcast. It's also a book, a free online grief group, and a one-on-one private coaching practice. If you are interested in learning more, visit mandykapehart.com to find out how restorative grief can help you heal heart, mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 250, titled 9 Wake-Up Calls of Grief and How to Heal from Them. What if the small, everyday signals you're ignoring are actually wake-up calls from your grief? Grief rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment. More often, it shows up quietly, through subtle patterns in your body, mind, and behavior. A constant ache in your jaw, a lingering sense of resentment, a loss of motivation, or even an outburst of anger may all be your system's way of asking for attention. So today, we're going to explore 9 common wake-up calls of grief, helping you recognize them and, more importantly, take deliberate action to respond and restore balance in your life. Grief rarely arrives as a single recognizable moment. It seeps in sideways, disguising itself as tension, restlessness, silence, or noise. Confusing, right? It speaks through the body before it ever finds language, and often we don't call it grief at all. We call it stress, burnout, irritability, distraction, and those are all individual experiences as well that don't necessarily mean we are grieving. But if you are listening closely, each signal can be a wake-up call, a quiet insistence that something within you deserves tending. So sometimes it begins with resentment. It's a slow, simmering feeling that others are asking too much or giving too little. Beneath resentment is often an unmet need, and beneath that, a quiet sorrow. So grief asks us, why did things have to be this way? And when no answer comes, it can harden into bitterness. Not because you are unkind, but because something tender has gone unheard. Then comes a loss of motivation, the heaviness that makes even simple tasks feel distant. This is not laziness. It is the nervous system conserving your energy in the presence of something overwhelming. Grief reshapes our priorities. What once mattered may no longer feel relevant, and what hurts may feel too large to approach. And so you pause, even if you don't understand why. You might find yourself dreaming of another life, one where things turned out differently, where you made other choices, or where loss never touched you in the same way. These imagined worlds are not escapes, they are reflections. They show you what you long for, what you miss, and what you wish had been possible. Grief doesn't only mourn what was, it mourns what could have been. And there's a particular loneliness in not knowing who to tell when you're struggling. Words hover at the edge of your throat, but there's no clear place for them to land. And this is one of grief's quietest forms, the absence of a witness. Healing begins often not with answers, but with just being seen. And sometimes grief becomes a noise, complaint after complaint, a steady stream of dissatisfaction in our lives. It can look like negativity, but it's often a signal that something feels persistently wrong. The psyche keeps circling the same point, trying to resolve what has not yet been understood. Or maybe it's going the other way, forward motion without presence, without intention. Just planning the next thing, chasing the next moment, staying just ahead of being still. Because we know that in stillness, our grief waits. It sits in the back, waiting for us to notice and slow down. And to sit in the present is a risk that we don't want to take because we risk feeling everything that we've deferred. And so we keep on moving, not because we are carefree and lighthearted, but because we are heavy-hearted and being very careful. At its most extreme, our grief can demand attention through crisis, when the body or the mind can no longer carry what has been unprocessed. These moments are frightening, but they are also interruptions. They say this can no longer be ignored. They're not failures. They are our body's thresholds. This is actually what happened with me in a number of times in my life when I was grieving and working so hard to stay tightly put together and strong enough for everyone else. I have ended up hospitalized or at the urgent care, wondering what in the world is wrong with me, when the reality is everything I've compressed and repressed in my body is bursting out all at once. And sometimes after holding everything in for too long like that, it can also erupt, not just physically, but emotionally, through an outburst of anger that feels disproportionate or surprising, out of character, even to you, even when you know you're in great pain. But anger is often grief's most protective form. It creates space for us. It sets boundaries because no one wants to go through your anger when you're that big with it. It also releases pressure, but underneath it is something more fragile, asking not to be dismissed. See, restoration in this state does not mean erasing and ignoring these signals. It means learning to recognize them as the invitations they are, rather than ignoring them as vulnerable and dangerous. Resentment loosens when your needs are acknowledged. Your motivation returns when you honor your limits. The imagined life becomes a guide rather than a refuge, right? Words find their way to someone who can hold them. Complaints transform into clarity. Presence becomes less threatening to us. Your crisis becomes a turning point. Your anger gives you information. Grief shows up in these patterns in our lives, but we don't have to live within those patterns in order to honor our grief alone. What we want to establish is an ability and an inner strength and awareness of how to interrupt these patterns with intentional action. So I've organized these wake-up calls into what I would call 3 restorative paths. So the first restorative path is to acknowledge and voice what you're feeling. So this is where we can look at if we're experiencing resentment, a loss of motivation, or dreaming about another life, because they share a theme of an internalized grief or an unexpressed need, right? So we want to name our feelings and our unmet needs in writing or with a trusted person. We want to take one small step that's concrete and defined to re-engage with our goals or our responsibilities, or just reconnect with the desires of our heart and what moves us toward action. And lastly, we want to translate our longing into one actionable choice today. So if we're daydreaming about a life lived outdoors more often, what's one literal step toward the outdoors that we can take that allows us to become this other version of ourselves that we're dreaming of? The second restorative path is to interrupt rumination and reground in the present. So this includes the wake-up calls of not knowing or having someone to talk to, constantly complaining, or consistently planning ahead instead of being in the present. And a theme here is shared patterns of stuckness and avoidance or mental looping and not knowing how to break out of that. So first, you want to reach out and share your struggles or your pain with someone that you trust. And this doesn't have to be someone nearby. It doesn't have to be a long-standing friendship. It can be someone you've only just met that feels aligned and is willing to listen. It can be someone that you meet online. It can be writing a letter to someone and saying, can you text me when you get this? So there's lots of ways to reach out and to share your struggle or your concern with someone who doesn't feel obligated to share their own stories or to fix what you're going through. With constant complaining, we want to identify what that complaint is and transfer it into some kind of tangible action. What can we do on behalf of ourselves? If this is hurting us, is it hurting us? Is it hurting our beliefs? What is it causing harm about in our lives? And how do we take a little bit of ownership to be intentional toward that scenario? And last, we want to dedicate focus time to fully be in the present moment, even if it's brief. One of my favorite ways to do this is through remembering to breathe. I know it seems so trite, but there's so much evidence-based study around breath work and around the importance of taking a deep breath, of pacing our speech. Even now, think about how different it feels to hear me speaking with slower, calmer tone than that energized, excited, let me teach you something kind of breath work. And lastly, that third restorative path is to respond constructively to our crisis or our strong emotions. So this looks at the wake-up calls of lots of tension in the body, hospitalization or crisis in our health, and strong outbursts of anger. Because the shared theme here is there are strong signals demanding our immediate attention. First, we want to tend to our body through a release of tension, whether that is with breathing, whether that is with slow, gentle movement or body-focused practices, whether it's interpreting different somatic activities in safe and accessible ways for ourselves throughout the day or in set aside times. This is not about turning out and becoming a yogi. This is not about quitting your day job and becoming a hiking expert so that you're constantly on the move. This is about acknowledging where the body is experiencing and holding tension and how generous we can be, helping our body to release it. Second, we want to seek professional or medical intervention when we are overwhelmed or feeling incapable of caring for ourselves. And I don't mean incapable in the way of waiting till the last minute, because hospitalization is not the goal here. Being able to advocate for ourselves and care for ourselves before we get to the crisis point is really, really necessary. And often an assist from a professional is a great way to set ourselves up well. And lastly, we want to trace any anger as well as we can back to its source so that we can identify what is it that pushed us this far and how can we take a protective or a restorative action to care for ourselves while validating this anger. The shift in all of these wake-up calls is from a passive reaction to an intentional response. These patterns keep circulating our grief when they go unchecked. So by choosing one deliberate action from any of these categories when we notice a pattern, we begin moving our grief from unconscious cycles into conscious restoration. Grief is not a detour from your life. Grief is a part of our lives. It moves through us in different forms, asking again and again to be noticed, to be named, and to be met with care. So when you begin to listen and act, not all at once, in grand gestures, but in small, patient ways, something shifts. So today, even as you're listening now, notice how your grief shows up. Whether as quiet longing, mental looping, or strong physical and emotional reactions, and pick one thing from these categories to respond differently. Don't try to resolve everything at once, but let this be your practice, a deliberate awareness and choice to meet your grief with care, to shift the patterns that no longer serve you, and to move toward restoration. You do not have to fix everything at once, and you can't. So permission granted to stop trying. It's just one small intentional act that is enough to begin changing your relationship with what has been lost. Thank you for listening to episode 250 of Restorative Grief. Grief shows up in so many subtle ways, and noticing these small signals is the first step toward restoring balance in your life. Take a moment this week to see where you can respond to yourself with curiosity, meet your needs with small, intentional actions, and create moments of presence and ease. If this is your first time listening to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart, I am so grateful you found your way here. Thank you, as always, to the patrons of the show who keep this work alive and growing. Please check out the show notes if you're interested in learning more about becoming a patron for as little as $2 a month. And be sure to subscribe and, of course, leave a review so that others who are grieving can find this work and support themselves differently as well. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.